The smallest decision you make when nobody is watching may become the reason your entire life changes. Grace Bennett repeated those words silently as she stepped out of the taxi and looked up at the towering glass skyscraper that seemed to disappear into the bright Manhattan morning sky. Carter Holdings occupied the top floors of the building, and somewhere above the clouds waited the interview that could finally change everything. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather handbag and checked the time on her inexpensive wristwatch. 8:53 in the morning. She had arrived 7 minutes early, exactly as she had planned. Being late had never been an option for someone who spent every dollar carefully and measured every opportunity even more carefully. Before entering the revolving glass doors, she reached into her purse and smiled at a crayon drawing folded neatly beside her resume. It showed a woman holding the hand of a little boy beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in careful, uneven letters, were the words, "Good luck, Mommy." Liam had insisted she carry it with her. Grace slipped the drawing back into her bag, squared her shoulders, and walked inside. The lobby reflected polished marble, quiet elegance, and the kind of success she had only seen in magazines while waiting at the dentist's office. Men and women in tailored business suits crossed the floor with practiced confidence, speaking softly into wireless headsets while digital displays scrolled financial headlines across towering screens. Grace felt the familiar whisper of self-doubt begin to rise, but she pushed it aside. She had earned this interview. Years of balancing spreadsheets by day, caring for her son by night, and studying for professional certifications after he fell asleep had led her here. A concierge greeted her warmly before escorting her to a private elevator that required a security badge. "Mr. Carter will meet you upstairs," the concierge said with a polite smile. Grace thanked him and stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, the city slowly disappeared beneath her while sunlight spilled through transparent glass walls, painting golden reflections across the polished floor. The elevator finally opened onto a private penthouse unlike anything she had imagined. It was elegant without feeling excessive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, soft instrumental music drifted quietly through hidden speakers, and the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the spacious living area. Before Grace could admire the view any longer, she heard the unmistakable sound of running water. She turned toward the modern kitchen where a sleek chrome faucet continued pouring a thin but steady stream into a deep farmhouse sink. It was not flooding the room, but it was clearly leaking from the base, sending clean water endlessly down the drain. Grace glanced around. No one seemed to notice. A man's calm voice floated from another room. He appeared to be finishing a video conference behind partially closed glass doors. She could hear only fragments of sentences about quarterly forecasts and overseas investments before the door closed again. Grace looked back at the faucet. She tightened the handle gently, but the leak continued. Her father had spent 30 years repairing homes before arthritis forced him into retirement, and when she was a little girl, he often reminded her that small problems rarely stayed small if everyone ignored them. Without thinking twice, Grace quietly opened the cabinet beneath the sink. A compact toolbox rested neatly beside cleaning supplies. She hesitated for only a second before lifting out an adjustable wrench. Working carefully so she would not leave a single scratch behind, she tightened the loose fitting beneath the faucet, adjusted the connection, then slowly turned the handle again. The steady drip disappeared completely. She dried the few drops of water with a folded paper towel, returned every tool exactly where she had found it, and stepped back just as the glass office door opened. Benjamin Carter walked into the kitchen carrying a tablet in one hand, stopping mid-step when he noticed the silent sink, the neatly replaced toolbox, and the young woman calmly standing beside the counter as though nothing unusual had happened. Benjamin Carter lowered his tablet. Slowly, his attention shifting from the silent kitchen to the woman standing a few feet away with quiet composure. His eyes briefly moved toward the sink before returning to Grace. "The faucet stopped leaking," he said, almost to himself. Grace offered a polite smile. The connection underneath had worked itself loose. It only needed a slight adjustment. Benjamin glanced toward the cabinet beneath the sink. "You found the toolbox. I hope you do not mind," she replied. "I put everything back exactly where it was." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound left in the penthouse was the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant rhythm of New York traffic several dozen stories below. Benjamin finally smiled, not the practiced smile of a businessman greeting investors, but the genuine expression of someone pleasantly surprised. Most people would have ignored it. Grace shrugged gently. Probably. You are here for a job interview. Yes. Yet you repaired a faucet first. She looked at the perfectly dry sink before answering. Water should not be wasted if it does not have to be. Benjamin studied her face carefully, searching for any sign that she expected praise. He found none. She simply stated the obvious, as though kindness required no explanation. He placed his tablet on the marble kitchen island. Would you like some coffee before we begin? Grace nodded appreciatively. Thank you. Benjamin walked toward a high-end espresso machine, while Grace remained standing, unsure whether she should sit. Please, he said without turning around. Make yourself comfortable. Instead of immediately choosing one of the elegant leather chairs overlooking Central Park, Grace quietly walked to the cabinet where she had returned the toolbox. She noticed 2 coffee mugs resting upside down beside the machine. Without saying anything, she reached for them. Benjamin looked over his shoulder and laughed softly. You are helping again. Grace smiled. Old habits. He handed her a freshly brewed cup. Cream or sugar? Black is fine. He raised an eyebrow. That surprises me. Why? Most people expect expensive coffee in a place like this to come with something extra. Grace wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Coffee only has one job. If it does that well, I do not think it needs much help. Benjamin chuckled quietly. That might be the simplest business philosophy I have heard in years. They stood near the windows overlooking Manhattan, while morning sunlight painted long reflections across the polished hardwood floors. For the first time that morning, Grace felt the nervousness inside her chest begin to loosen. The conversation felt unusually ordinary, almost as though she had met an old neighbor instead of someone living in one of the city's most exclusive penthouses. Benjamin took a slow sip from his coffee. Tell me something, Grace. She looked at him attentively. How old is your son? Her expression softened immediately. Liam just turned 5. Exciting age. Very energetic age, she corrected with a quiet laugh. Benjamin smiled. Does he know where you are today? Grace nodded. He made me promise to smile during the interview. Benjamin noticed the warmth in her voice changed the entire room. Children give very specific advice, sometimes better than adults. He looked thoughtfully toward the skyline before asking another question. Was it difficult raising him alone? Grace answered honestly, never looking away. Some days are harder than others. There are weeks when every dollar has a destination before I even earn it. There are nights when I study after he falls asleep because I want him to see that giving up is never the easiest choice. Benjamin listened without interrupting. She never complained. She never asked for sympathy. She simply described her life with quiet dignity. He found that more impressive than any polished interview answer he had heard in years. Setting his coffee cup down, he glanced briefly at the hallway leading deeper into the penthouse before returning his attention to Grace. I think we have talked long enough. Grace instinctively reached for her portfolio. Benjamin smiled again, calm and unreadable. There is one thing I forgot to mention. She waited curiously. I should probably introduce myself before the interview begins. My name is Benjamin Carter, and I am the person making the final hiring decision today. Grace felt a brief wave of surprise, but it passed almost as quickly as it arrived. She had imagined meeting the chief executive later inside a formal boardroom, surrounded by executives and polished introductions. Instead, she had shared coffee, repaired a faucet, and spoken openly about her son before realizing she had been sitting across from the founder of Carter Holdings. She lowered her eyes for a single second before meeting Benjamin's calm expression once again. I suppose I should apologize if I was too informal, she said with an embarrassed smile. Benjamin shook his head immediately. Please do not. If anything, I appreciate that you spoke to me exactly the same way you would speak to anyone else. Grace exhaled softly. That is probably because I did not know who you were. Precisely, Benjamin replied. Honest conversations usually happen before titles enter the room. He picked up his tablet and motioned toward a hallway leading deeper into the penthouse. Come with me. Grace followed him through a spacious corridor decorated with contemporary artwork and warm oak paneling until they reached a pair of elegant double doors. Benjamin opened them without ceremony. Inside was a conference room unlike any she had ever seen. A long walnut table stretched across the center beneath modern pendant lighting, while floor-to-ceiling windows framed an uninterrupted view of Manhattan. Four executives were already seated with organized folders placed neatly before them. The moment Benjamin entered, every executive stood respectfully. Grace immediately understood that this room operated according to his presence rather than the clock. Benjamin introduced her with quiet confidence. "Good morning, everyone. This is Grace Bennett." The executives greeted her warmly before taking their seats again. Benjamin remained standing for another moment. "Thank you all for waiting. We are ready to begin." Grace settled into the chair opposite the panel, placing her leather portfolio carefully on the polished table. She folded her hands together beneath the edge of the table, reminding herself to breathe naturally. The anxiety she had expected finally arrived, yet it felt different now. Instead of fearing the people in front of her, she already knew one of them as the man who had casually shared coffee beside a kitchen window only minutes earlier. Benjamin took his seat at the center of the table, but did not immediately open her resume. Instead, he looked directly at her. "Grace, during the last 20 minutes, I learned about your son, your work ethic, and your opinion about wasting water." Several executives exchanged curious glances. Benjamin continued calmly. "Now I would like to learn how you think when business decisions become difficult." Grace nodded. "I understand." The vice president of finance opened the interview with questions about budgeting, forecasting, and financial reporting. Grace answered confidently, explaining how she had improved reporting accuracy at her previous employer by simplifying monthly reconciliation procedures. Rather than listing technical terminology, she described the practical decisions behind each improvement. Another executive presented a complex scenario involving shrinking revenue projections and rising operating expenses. Grace asked thoughtful, clarifying questions before answering, carefully explaining each step of her reasoning instead of rushing toward a conclusion. Benjamin listened quietly without interrupting. He noticed something unusual. Whenever Grace reached an uncertain point, she admitted what additional information she would need before making a recommendation. She never pretended to know more than she actually did. That honesty interested him even more than her financial knowledge. After nearly 30 minutes, one executive closed his notebook and smiled politely. "I believe we have covered everything on our list." Grace expected Benjamin to conclude the meeting as well. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his folded hands on the conference table. His expression remained calm, but his next words immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. "Actually," he said, looking directly into Grace's eyes, "I would like to set the resume aside for a while. The questions that matter most have nothing to do with accounting." The room grew noticeably quieter after Benjamin's words settled over the conference table. None of the executives appeared surprised. If anything, they leaned back with the patient expressions of people who had witnessed this shift before. Grace closed her portfolio without hesitation. She sensed that every answer from this point forward would reveal far more about her than any credential listed on her resume. Benjamin folded his hands calmly. "Imagine you discover that one of your highest-performing employees has quietly manipulated financial reports to make quarterly results look stronger. Correcting the reports will disappoint investors and reduce executive bonuses, including your own. Nobody else knows. What do you do?" Grace did not answer immediately. She looked toward the skyline beyond the windows before returning her attention to Benjamin. "I correct the reports," one executive asked, "even if it costs you the promotion you have worked years to earn?" Grace nodded. "A promotion built on dishonesty is only delayed failure. Numbers eventually tell the truth. I would rather explain disappointing results today than explain broken trust next year." Benjamin remained expressionless, but he noticed two executives writing notes. Another member of the panel leaned forward. "Suppose correcting those reports forces layoffs. Families lose income. Children are affected. Does that change your answer?" Grace paused longer this time. "It changes how I would handle the situation, but it does not change what is right. I would work day and night to find every possible alternative before reducing jobs. I would cut unnecessary spending, delay projects, reduce waste, and ask leadership to share the burden first. People should never become the easiest expense simply because they cannot defend themselves." The executive quietly lowered his pen. Benjamin continued. "What shaped that opinion?" Grace smiled gently. Life did. She looked down at her folded hands for only a moment before continuing. After Liam was born, I learned that every paycheck represents more than money. It represents groceries, school supplies, rent, medicine, and the promise that a child can sleep peacefully without worrying about tomorrow. When you understand what a paycheck means to a family, you stop seeing employees as numbers on a spreadsheet. Silence filled the room once again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Benjamin slowly stood and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking the city below. Thousands of people hurried through streets that looked impossibly small from 40 stories above. Without turning around, he asked another question. Have you ever failed? Grace smiled softly. Many times. Tell me about one. She answered without embarrassment. Years ago, I accepted a position that paid more money than I had ever earned. I thought success meant saying yes to every opportunity. Within 6 months, I realized the company rewarded people for hiding problems instead of solving them. I stayed too long because I needed the income. Leaving felt frightening, but staying would have taught my son the wrong lesson. Benjamin turned to face her. And what lesson did you want him to learn? Grace's answer came without hesitation. That character should never become something we trade for comfort. One of the executives quietly removed his glasses and smiled almost imperceptibly. Benjamin returned to his chair, studying Grace with the same quiet curiosity he had felt when he watched her repair the faucet earlier that morning. He realized she never attempted to impress anyone in the room. She simply answered every question as though she were speaking to another human being rather than a panel deciding her future. There was no performance, no rehearsed confidence, only steady honesty shaped by ordinary struggles. Benjamin finally rested his hands on the conference table again. Grace, he said calmly, there is one final situation I would like you to consider. It is not about accounting, leadership, or even business. It is about something much simpler, and your answer may be the most important one you give today. Benjamin held Grace's gaze for several quiet seconds before asking his final question. Imagine you are walking into work on your first day. You notice a maintenance employee struggling to carry several heavy boxes across the lobby. You are already running a few minutes late for an important meeting with senior leadership. If you stop to help, you may begin your first day with a poor impression. If you keep walking, nobody will question your decision. What would you do? Grace smiled almost immediately. I would help. Benjamin tilted his head slightly. Even if it hurts your career? If helping another person hurts my career, Grace replied calmly, then I probably walked into the wrong company. One executive quietly looked down at his notes while another exchanged a thoughtful glance with the vice president of finance. Benjamin remained silent for a moment before asking, why are you so certain? Grace rested her hands comfortably on the table. Because every organization eventually becomes a reflection of what its people ignore. Small acts shape culture. If everyone walks past someone who needs help because they are chasing the next meeting, eventually nobody feels responsible for anyone else. Benjamin nodded almost imperceptibly. Interesting. He stood once more and slowly walked toward the conference room door. Without saying anything, he opened it and looked down the hallway leading back toward the kitchen. Do all of you know why the faucet in my kitchen was leaking this morning? The executives looked at one another before one of them answered. Facilities has been scheduled to replace it this afternoon. Benjamin smiled faintly. That is correct. He turned back toward Grace. Do you know how long it has been leaking? She gently shook her head. 5 days. The room became perfectly still. Benjamin continued. Housekeeping saw it. My assistant saw it. Several executives visited this penthouse during the week. Contractors walked through yesterday. Every one of them noticed the sound. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. Nobody touched it. Grace listened quietly without saying a word. Benjamin slowly returned to his chair. Do you know why I never called a plumber? She hesitated. No. He folded his hands. Because I was curious. Several executives smiled knowingly. Benjamin looked directly at Grace. Curious whether someone would see a small problem and quietly solve it without expecting credit. Grace blinked in surprise. The faucet. Benjamin nodded. It cost almost nothing to repair. That was never the point. He glanced around the room before continuing. Leadership is often described as making bold decisions, delivering inspiring speeches, or negotiating major contracts. In my experience, true leadership usually appears in much quieter moments. It reveals itself when nobody is keeping score. Grace looked toward the polished conference table, replaying the morning in her mind. She had never considered that tightening one loose fitting beneath a sink could carry any significance beyond stopping wasted water. Benjamin smiled warmly. When you arrived this morning, you believed your interview would begin after introductions. He shook his head gently. It began the moment you walked through my front door. Grace felt a mixture of disbelief and humility settle over her. Every ordinary conversation over coffee, every simple answer, every unnoticed decision had carried more weight than she realized. Benjamin continued softly. You never asked whether fixing the faucet was part of the interview. You never looked around to see if anyone was watching. You simply noticed something that needed attention and decided to make life a little better for the next person. He leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. That is much harder to teach than accounting, and infinitely more valuable to build inside a company. Grace sat quietly, absorbing Benjamin's words while the conference room remained wrapped in thoughtful silence. She looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan, then back at the people seated around the table. I did not fix your faucet because I thought someone might reward me, she said softly. Honestly, I forgot about it the moment the water stopped running. Benjamin smiled with quiet appreciation. Exactly. He leaned back in his chair. The most meaningful choices are usually the ones people forget because they never expected recognition in the first place. The vice president of finance closed his notebook. Mr. Carter, he said, I believe we have enough information to make our recommendation. Benjamin nodded politely. I would like a few more minutes with Grace before we vote. The executive stood, thanked Grace for her time, and quietly stepped out of the conference room, leaving the door gently closed behind them. For the first time that morning, only Grace and Benjamin remained. The atmosphere immediately felt less formal. Benjamin removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of his chair before walking toward the coffee station built into the corner of the room. Another cup? He asked. Grace smiled. Thank you. I would like that. As the coffee brewed, neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Benjamin finally spoke while pouring 2 fresh cups. Do you know why I still interview finalists personally? Grace shook her head. Most chief executives would probably delegate that responsibility. He handed her a mug before answering. Because I made a mistake years ago that I promised myself I would never repeat. Grace listened carefully. Benjamin stared into his coffee for a moment before continuing. Early in my career, I hired the smartest executive I had ever met. His credentials were extraordinary. Every interview praised his intelligence. Every reference described remarkable results. Benjamin sighed quietly. Within 2 years, he nearly destroyed the culture of this company. Grace remained silent. She sensed he was not telling a business story. He was remembering something personal. He treated people as tools instead of human beings. Profits increased for a while, but trust disappeared. Talented employees resigned. Departments stopped cooperating. Everyone became afraid of making mistakes because they believed mistakes mattered more than integrity. Benjamin looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. Numbers recovered eventually. People took much longer. Grace slowly nodded. Culture is harder to rebuild than a balance sheet. Benjamin looked back at her with quiet surprise. Yes, that is exactly right. He smiled faintly. Ever since then, I stopped asking myself who is the smartest candidate. I started asking a different question. Grace waited. Who will make the person sitting beside them better? The words lingered between them. Grace thought about the offices where she had worked, the managers who had inspired loyalty, and the ones who had measured success only by quarterly reports. She realized she had never considered leadership from Benjamin's perspective. He continued, his voice calm and sincere. Technical skills can be taught. Software changes. Regulations change. Markets change. Character rarely changes unless life changes it first. Grace wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. My father used to tell me something similar. He always said that if a person returns borrowed tools cleaner than they found them, they will probably return trust the same way. Benjamin laughed softly. Your father sounds like a wise man. Grace smiled. He repaired houses for 30 years. He believed everything deserved to leave your hands a little better than it arrived. Benjamin became thoughtful again. Perhaps that is exactly how companies should work as well. He walked toward the conference room door, but paused before opening it. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. Grace, before the board comes back inside, There is one more thing you should know. She looked at him expectantly. His reflection shimmered against the glass wall as he smiled almost to himself. This position is not the only opportunity one have been considering for you today. Grace looked at Benjamin with quiet confusion. I am not sure I understand, she admitted. Benjamin rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair before speaking. The position you applied for is financial controller. It is an important role, and based on your experience, I believe you could perform it very well. He paused for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. But after spending this morning with you, I am beginning to think your greatest value to this company has very little to do with financial statements. Grace blinked in surprise. I have spent my entire career in accounting. Benjamin smiled. Exactly. Everyone else who applied also has accounting experience. What they cannot all offer is the ability to quietly improve every room they enter. Before Grace could respond, the conference room door opened and the executives returned to their seats. Benjamin remained standing. Thank you for waiting. He picked up a folder from the center of the table, but left it unopened. Before we conclude today's interview, I would like everyone to hear the same proposal at the same time. The executives exchanged curious glances. This was clearly not part of the schedule they had expected. Benjamin turned toward Grace. Over the past year, we have invested millions of dollars in technology, operations, and expansion. Yet our employee engagement surveys reveal something money cannot solve. Departments work efficiently, but they do not always work compassionately. New employees often feel invisible during their first weeks. Managers focus on results, but forget relationships. We have become successful enough to overlook the small human moments that once defined this company. Grace listened without interrupting. Benjamin continued. This morning, before your interview officially began, you reminded me of the culture we used to have. He looked around the room. Not by giving a speech, not by presenting a strategy, simply by noticing a problem and fixing it because it was the right thing to do. One executive nodded thoughtfully, while another smiled in quiet agreement. Benjamin looked back at Grace. If you joined Carter Holdings, would you be willing to help build something larger than financial reports? Grace hesitated. I would need to understand what you mean. Benjamin walked toward the windows overlooking the city before answering. I want every employee who walks into this company to feel that someone notices them. I want leaders who remember names before job titles. I want departments that solve problems together instead of protecting individual success. Culture cannot be purchased. It has to be demonstrated every single day by ordinary choices. Grace considered his words carefully. They reminded her of evenings helping Liam with simple chores, teaching him that putting away his toys mattered because someone else would walk across the floor later. Small actions always reach people they never met. Benjamin continued, his voice steady and sincere. The financial controller position remains available, and I believe you have earned it. But I would also like you to spend part of your time working directly with senior leadership on employee culture, mentorship, and leadership development. Not because you have studied organizational psychology, because you already practice something many people spend years trying to learn. Grace looked down at the family photo tucked inside her portfolio. Liam's smiling face looked back at her beside the crayon drawing that still rested between her documents. She thought about every difficult morning, every careful budget, every late night spent studying after her son had fallen asleep. None of those sacrifices had been made to become extraordinary. They had simply taught her to care about people even when life felt complicated. She looked back at Benjamin. I do not know if I have all the answers. Benjamin smiled warmly. That is not what I am looking for. I am looking for someone who asks the right questions and never forgets that every balance sheet represents real families. The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence felt hopeful. For the first time in many years, Benjamin believed he was no longer hiring someone to fill a position. He was inviting someone to help restore the heart of a company. Grace took a slow breath before answering. If I accept this opportunity, I want to earn it for the right reasons. Benjamin nodded with quiet curiosity. Tell me what those reasons are. She looked around the conference room before speaking. I do not want anyone believing I received special treatment because I fixed a faucet. If I join this company, I want every employee to know I was hired because I can do the work, not because I happened to be standing in the right kitchen at the right time. A warm smile appeared on Benjamin's face. He had hoped she would say exactly that. Without a word, he opened the folder that had remained closed throughout the interview and slid several pages across the polished table toward her. Grace lowered her eyes and immediately recognized detailed evaluation forms completed by every executive in the room. Each assessment had been written independently before Benjamin revealed anything about the Faucet. The comments were remarkably consistent. Exceptional financial judgment. Strong analytical thinking. Clear communicator. Demonstrates integrity under pressure. Outstanding leadership potential. Grace looked up, visibly surprised. Benjamin folded his hands calmly. Before anyone in this room knew what happened in my kitchen, every evaluator had already recommended moving you to the final hiring stage. One executive smiled. Your interview scores were among the highest we have seen this year. Another nodded. The Faucet confirmed something. It did not create it. Grace felt a quiet sense of relief settle over her shoulders. Benjamin continued. Your professional qualifications opened the door. Your character simply showed us who would be walking through it. He reached into the folder once more and removed a formal offer letter bearing the Carter Holdings logo. Grace Bennett, I would like to officially offer you the position of financial controller, along with a leadership assignment working directly with me on our company culture initiative. Grace accepted the envelope carefully, almost as though it contained something fragile. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked at Benjamin. May I ask one question? Of course. Why are you trusting someone you met only this morning with something so important? Benjamin smiled thoughtfully before answering. Because I did not meet your character this morning. I simply witnessed it. His words settled quietly across the room. Character is built long before interviews happen. Parents build it. Difficult seasons build it. Ordinary mornings build it. By the time someone walks through my front door, most of the important work has already been done. Grace thought about her father repairing homes one family at a time, about her mother teaching her to leave every place cleaner than she found it, and about Liam watching everything she did even when he seemed distracted by crayons or toy cars. She realized those ordinary moments had quietly prepared her for opportunities she never imagined. Benjamin stood and extended his hand. Welcome to Carter Holdings, Grace. She shook his hand firmly, gratitude shining in her eyes without overwhelming her composure. Around the table, the executives applauded softly, not with dramatic celebration, but with genuine respect. As the meeting concluded, Benjamin walked beside Grace toward the elevator. Before the doors opened, he paused. Tomorrow morning, you will receive orientation like every other new employee. Grace smiled. Good. Benjamin looked at her with quiet amusement. You sound relieved. I am, she admitted. I would rather begin as part of the team than above it. Benjamin nodded approvingly. That answer tells me we made the right decision. The elevator doors opened, and Grace stepped inside, holding the offer letter close to her portfolio. As the doors slowly closed, she caught one final glimpse of Benjamin standing in the hallway with a peaceful expression. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about profits, market forecasts, or quarterly reports. He was thinking about the remarkable difference one unnoticed act of kindness could make when it quietly reminded an entire company what success was truly supposed to look like. 6 weeks later, the headquarters of Carter Holdings felt noticeably different. The changes were subtle at first, almost impossible to measure on a spreadsheet, yet everyone seemed to notice them. Managers began starting meetings by asking about people before projects. New employees found handwritten welcome notes waiting on their desks. Departments that had rarely spoken to one another now shared ideas over coffee instead of exchanging formal emails. Grace never announced these changes as a grand initiative. She simply lived the same principles that had guided her long before she walked into Benjamin Carter's penthouse. Others quietly began doing the same. On a bright Saturday morning in early autumn, colorful banners decorated the company's courtyard for its annual Family Day celebration. Laughter replaced the usual rhythm of business conversations as children explored activity booths, employees introduced their families, and live music drifted through the crisp New York air. Grace arrived holding Liam's small hand. The little boy looked around with wide eyes, fascinated by the fountains, balloons, and rows of food trucks parked along the plaza. Mommy, he whispered excitedly. Your office is huge. Grace smiled. It feels a little smaller once you know everyone. Liam looked up at her proudly. That is because you make friends everywhere. Before Grace could answer, Benjamin approached wearing a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual business suit. Without the formality of the office, he looked less like the billionaire whose name stood above the entrance and more like someone enjoying a quiet weekend among people he genuinely appreciated. "Good morning, Grace." He looked down with a warm smile. "And you must be Liam." The little boy nodded confidently. "Yes, sir." Benjamin knelt until they were nearly eye level. "Your mother has told us a great deal about you." Liam grinned. "She tells me about work, too." Benjamin laughed softly. "I hope only the interesting parts." Liam thought for a moment before answering with complete sincerity. "Mom says everybody matters." Benjamin glanced at Grace before looking back at the little boy. "She is absolutely right." Liam pointed toward a decorative water fountain near the center of the courtyard where a maintenance employee was adjusting a loose sprinkler head. "Mommy fixes things too." Grace smiled with gentle embarrassment. "Sometimes." Liam shook his head enthusiastically. "She fixes everything. At home, she fixed our kitchen drawer. She fixed my bicycle. She even fixed Mrs. Wilson's mailbox after the storm." Benjamin looked at Grace with quiet understanding. Then he smiled at Liam and said, "I believe you are right. Your mother fixes much more than broken things." Grace lowered her eyes modestly while nearby employees continued greeting one another with easy laughter. Benjamin stood and watched as teams from different departments mixed together naturally, introducing spouses, grandparents, and children without worrying about titles or office politics. Months earlier, he had believed culture required complicated strategies. Now he understood it often began with ordinary people choosing small acts of kindness when nobody expected them. He turned back toward Grace. "Do you know something?" She looked at him curiously. "That faucet has never leaked again." Grace laughed softly. "I am glad to hear it." Benjamin smiled. "So am I. But I eventually realized the faucet was never the thing that needed repairing." He looked across the courtyard where employees helped one another carry folding chairs, refill drinks, and entertain restless children without anyone asking them to do so. Sometimes one quiet decision reminds an entire company what success is really built on. Grace looked at Liam, who was already running toward a craft table with a huge smile on his face, and she felt the same quiet gratitude she had carried since the morning she almost walked past a dripping faucet. She had entered that penthouse hoping someone would believe in her abilities. She had never imagined that the smallest choice she made before sitting down would inspire something far greater than a job. Because in the end, the greatest opportunities rarely begin with extraordinary talent. They begin with ordinary kindness, offered freely when nobody is watching.